So I don't think I've ever quite given a talk like this, going places with QGIS. Usually I'm giving a more tech talk, and feels a little indulgent, but I'll basically be telling my QGIS story. And along the way, I'm going to show you examples of QGIS related work I've done. And I do feel like QGIS has given me tremendous opportunities, many of which have involved travel. So this will be a temporal spatial talk. So Cliff already introduced me a bit. Just to say that I was an early adopter of QGIS. First downloaded it in 2005 when it was at 0.7, and I started teaching quite early too. I did my first course in 2009 when it was at version 1.0 core. And this has been indeed a big year. And for Cliff and anyone else, if you want Santa to bring you the QGIS for hydrological applications, make sure you get the second edition, which just came out. Hans van der Kwaas and I published the second edition in May this year. So this second edition has some very important updates involving swapping out Saga for PC raster and some other nice features around mesh data. And it's updated to QGIS 3.2.2. And on the right, which just came out in August, is that second edition of Discover QGIS 3X, which is updated to QGIS 3.2.6 and includes 7 new chapters and lots of great features. So you can find both of those on Locate Press. So that's my shameless plug there. So I started out as an archaeologist. And so this is me in the 90s. I had long hair, and I was an archaeologist in New Mexico in the Southwest. And so this was my first career, and I left to get a master's in geography to get a real job. And GIS, is a great fit for archaeology. And ironically, over the years, I've only ever had one archaeological customer. So I don't know why that is, but I still have a good background in archaeology. So let's start out here. My story starts in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the southwestern part of the United States. It's the 5th biggest state in the US, but certainly doesn't have a large population. And I went to graduate school and started my business and working in GIS in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I got a master's in geography and then started working, even before that was quite finished, at this place called the Earth Data Analysis Center at the university, which was a business that operates out of the university. So it's not part of the budget of the university, but they do GIS and remote sensing. And it was a fantastic place to learn how to manage projects and work with GIS on a variety of things. And I started out, doing Perl and PHP scripting, and this was the place that gave me my start in open source, because at the time there was this horrible software, not because it was made by Esri, but I think even Esri people admit this was horrible software. It was Esri ArcIMS, Internet MapServer, and we were this is the early days of WebGIS, and we were starting to stand up websites and web mapping sites, and that software would crash every weekend, and we'd have to go in and restart the servers, and websites aren't so great when the server goes down. So a colleague of mine discovered Minnesota MapServer, which was in its early days, and it took me and my office mate probably close to a week to build that from source. There weren't like nice double-click executables in those days. We built it from source. And but once we got MapServer up and running, the sites would just run endlessly. It was super fast, super stable, and that's what really turned me on to the possibility of using open source more broadly. So this shot here is the very first MapServer users meeting in 2003. So this was before OSGeo existed. It's kind of the roots of OSGeo. OSGeo was formed a couple years later from this group. So there was, almost 100 of us there. I'm right there in the back, a younger version of me. And so by this time in early 2000s, we were using MapServer. We had started using early versions of PostGIS, and Google to work with our data. And I still say Google because at these conferences, I took a workshop from Frank Warmerdan, and he pronounced it Google. So I know there's some controversy on how to pronounce that, but that's where I got that from. So that was an interesting meeting, and we started going back to these every year. And somewhere along the lines, we were still using Esri software, but I was always curious if there would ever be an open source desktop. And I think it was my office mate who discovered it, and he said, "Hey, check this out." And we found QGIS in 2005, and we downloaded it, and this is what it looked like. So it's come a long way. And so in 2005, it looked like this at version 0.7, and it was cute, but you couldn't really do that much with it. You could bring in some data and symbolize it. And it certainly already worked with PostGIS, since that's one of the reasons Gary Sherman started QGIS. So I kept monitoring this to see when it would be something I could start using for real. And shortly thereafter, I'd been at the university for almost 10 years and decided to start my own business. And it was probably one of the most scary things I've ever done. But I'd been working on side projects for several years before this. And I must say, in the years prior to leaving and starting my own business, I was essentially working 2 jobs as I ramped up my consulting business to a point where I felt like I could actually pull this off. And my first focus area, and still my strongest focus area of applying GIS, is to conservation. So I started out working almost exclusively with conservation organizations, and then years later got into public health and teaching. And so in these early days of my business, I did have an Esri license for 1 seat of ArcGIS with the spatial analyst extension. But I used to joke, if I could shed that, I could take a month vacation for what I was paying for the license. And so I was watching QGIS closely and using it as much as possible. And so I don't know where this slide fit in here, but I thought I wanted to put it in here somewhere. So here it is, why I use QGIS. So especially in these early days, one of the early strengths of QGIS was the interoperability. Like I would have customers give me KML files as data sets and things like that. And with Esri, it was always having to run a processing tool to bring that in and start working with it. Whereas in QGIS, I could just drag and drop it and start working with it automatically. And so that interoperability and just some tasks being easier just made my job easier. And so I started using it more and more. But I also just love how rapidly QGIS has developed and continues to develop. Every 4 months when the visual change logs come out, you can see all the new features, and it's like Christmas morning 3 times a year. I think QGIS now at this point also has some really amazing takes on how to work with spatial data. Like the editing in place feature in the processing toolbox is fantastic. And if you haven't used that, you should look it up. And geometry generators continue to astound me with what you can do with those as more and more expressions and functions are added to QGIS. I think QGIS has incredible cartographic tools. It's fast. And I think one of the things early on that really made me passionate about QGIS was the community, and just how welcoming and warm the community has always been. And then lastly, is one of the most important ones when you're running a business, is that I can have new features added that help my job. I can hire a developer to develop new features, and it's usually fairly affordable to get that done. So through the years, I get this question a lot, like basically, how can I do what you've done? How can I run my own GIS consulting business? And it's a tricky question because I don't have the formula for that, and I don't always know what to tell people. I just know what's worked for me. But anyway, one way I can answer that is I did a podcast with Mapscaping with Daniel O'Donoghue in 2020, where he interviewed me about self-employment in the geospatial industry. And so I kind of give a lot of my thoughts during this podcast, if you want to look that up. Ironically, 6 months later, I took a job for a company in Denmark, and I'm no longer self-employed. But I was self-employed for 13, 14 years. So I have a lot of experience with it. So one of the things that I think was, I don't know how unique it was, but it felt a little different to me, was that I was basically the GIS guy for several organizations, several conservation nonprofits, and I still am today. So this means I actually did all their GIS. I managed their data. I still do. I still have massive backups of 10 years of data for some organizations. I produced their maps, did spatial analysis for them. So I wasn't really in the business of making products and selling them to people. At this point, I wasn't even really teaching. I was just doing GIS for organizations and being their GIS guy. And the pros of this was that they didn't care what software I used. So I could use any solution that worked for me to get the job done. And they just needed analysis results and maps. And to this day, most of them don't even know what I'm using. They've never even asked. So that was kind of a nice part of that. So this focus on conservation GIS is really where my passion has always been. I've worked for most of the nonprofit conservation organizations in the Western US at some point. And so my main areas of expertise through all this are kind of rewilding, which is kind of a hot term now. The man who invented the term rewilding actually lived in Albuquerque, Dave Foreman, and became a close friend of mine. I did a lot of modeling for potential wildlife habitat and wildlife corridors, which is fascinating work, very rapidly developing field. I worked a lot on wilderness and roadless area issues and protected lands. So this is my favorite niche. And so I would do things like this. So this was a map for the California Wilderness Coalition on a proposed national monument. And so I would, they would basically just ask me tell me what they needed, and I have the usual questions: what size? Do you have any special wording you want me to use? And because these are usually campaigns where particular language is favored. And so I would kind of have cartographic license to put together something that worked for the thing. So this was one of the nicer campaign maps I think I put together, done in QGIS. This is another one. This is for a campaign where this gentleman, John Davis, for the Wildlands Network, under his own power, this was a tremendous thing. He basically traveled from Mexico to Canada along the Continental Divide using his own power, walking, mountain biking, paddling, and along the way highlighting wildlife corridor issues. And it tried to make it a big media campaign. So he'd go by the morning news in a local town, and because they had heard about him doing this, and talk to them about what it's like for wildlife trying to cross an interstate and things like that. And so I made a number of maps for his campaign to do that. It was a 7,000-mile journey. This is a map I did for potential mountain lion habitat for, who is this for? This is for the Wilderness Society? No, the Humane Society. This was done for the Humane Society. And so this was one where I had to take data sets from 15 different states and try to cross match them. There are certainly some issues that pop up where you see state borders in the results, but overall, the results were pretty accurate compared to models done in local states. And so we use this to generate acreages of potential habitat by different game management hunt units in different states and things like that. This is an example of a wildlife corridor analysis. I did one for New Mexico, looking at where mountain lions would get from one habitat patch to another. And I modeled 25 corridors across New Mexico. So this was one near where I lived, and this is a famous wildlife corridor in New Mexico. There's been some work done on the interstate here. It's a very busy interstate. And the only way I could really validate the model was by pulling in roadkill records. So these little blue triangles were mountain lion roadkill. And this also was basically the area where on the ground studies indicated that mountain lions were crossing. So this was an interesting analysis exercise. This took the better part of a year to complete all of that. And this was the most recent wildlife habitat connectivity model I did. This is one for a portion of western New Mexico and eastern Arizona, and it's modeling connectivity for Mexican wolves. And I used this software called CircuitScape, which is an open source software that you can use to basically, it uses the paradigm behind electrical conductivity, and you build a raster resistant surface, and it will model connectivity across an entire region. And so that you can then identify just broad swaths of connectivity, because wildlife corridors are inherently complex. There's not a literal hallway where a moose is going to walk down to go from one area to another. They become kind of dispersal regions, and different species require different lengths and widths and characteristics of those corridors to make them useful. So CircuitScape is a really interesting software that was created by Brad McRae of the Nature Conservancy, and it's open source. And so the final maps were done in QGIS. So those are some examples of conservation outputs. And around the same time, I decided, in 2008, those in the US remember there was a recession. So the first year I started my own business and left the university, there was a recession, which was a little scary. So I decided an early business strategy would be to diversify as much as possible. So I started teaching as well, and I've always enjoyed teaching and discovered I was good at it. So I've been teaching at my local community college and continuing ed program, and the first courses were all Esri based, but I had already kind of caught the open source bug. So I developed an introduction to open source GIS class in 2008 and started teaching it in 2009. And it's one of the very first semester long open source courses I think that ever existed. And I would teach QGIS, PostGIS, MapServer, and I would even have an exercise where I would have the students choose one of another kind of competing open source desktop softwares like OpenJump or UDig or GVSig. They would have to bring in 2 layers and complete just a very simple analysis, and then share with the class the pros and cons of that software. So the whole class got to learn about different softwares that were out there. It was fascinating. So this is one of the final courses I taught of that. This course is now a required course at Central New Mexico Community College to this day in the GIT program, and had fantastic students. And it was just so exciting to see these students really get it, and a lot of them are still passionate about open source to this day, which is one of my proudest achievements, really. So the following year, I actually wrote an article in Directions magazine about my experience teaching free and open source. And it's still up there, but my main takeaway was that when you're teaching an intro to GIS course, you notice that at a certain point, the students are just kind of going from step 17 to step 18, and they're just clicking buttons, and it's not always immediately sinking into them what they're doing. And when I built this course, I basically replicated some of the exercises they'd done in their intro to GIS with Esri, but I had them do it in QGIS. And I noticed that when they had to do this again in a different software, the concepts behind the analysis sunk in a little deeper, and thinking about the data sunk in a little deeper. And I think it was really helpful to the students and their learning to have to replicate something in a different software. So the next place this took me was to Washington, D.C., which is where I grew up. So I'd been running my business for a few years in Albuquerque. And from one of my contacts at the University of New Mexico, I was put in touch with some people at the National Library of Medicine in Washington, D.C. So I flew to Washington, D.C., and basically put together a program called Community Health Maps for the National Library of Medicine. So this ran for 7 years, 7 or 8 years. And then I'll tell you about the demise of this program, but it was quite successful. And the webpage is actually still up there. But the goal was to empower community organizations. And so we were thinking about organizations who are working with vulnerable populations, minority populations, populations in poverty, but that frequently use and collect data and needed some kind of mapping tools to accomplish their goals. And but we're also, most of these organizations lack the monetary resources for proprietary GIS and training. So what we would do is go in and give presentations, and we kind of worked under this train the trainer paradigm, where I would go in and train leaders in that community, and then they could go around and train other community members and how to collect and manage mapping data. And we had a blog, lab exercises, and things like that. And so there were kind of 3 legs to this stool of this workflow. We would show them how to collect data on their tablets and smartphones, and the tools that we used for this changed over the years as different things came online. We would then show them how to use QGIS to start mapping and analyzing that data. And sometimes they would also want to make an internet map. So we would work with Cardo at those times. And Cardo in the end actually gave us a license to start using once Cardo became cost prohibitive. So there were a few case studies. This is, and I probably did 50 trainings for this, so there's far more than I could ever show. But there were a few notable ones. So the first one we did after we kind of got organized and got some materials developed was in Seattle. So there was an organization in Seattle that we had connections to called the Urban Indian Health Institute. And they basically work with urban Indian populations in Seattle to provide them healthcare. And so we chose them as a pilot study, and they were interested in noise pollution and health. So we went in and did our 1-day in-person training, and they wanted to survey Native American neighborhoods for noise pollution, because it can be a chronic health problem related to hypertension and heart disease and other health issues. And so they wanted to measure the noise in different neighborhoods. So one of the advantages of using smartphones to collect data is that there's an app for that. And so at the time, I mean, there's a number of them now, but at the time we used this SPLN FFT noise meter app. And we went out into Native American communities and showed them how to collect points. They did decibel sensitivity studies with this, and went to the same locations during different points of the day and week to get an average noise level for that. So they developed a pretty sound protocol. This is one of the maps they made from just that first day's workshop, though, where they went out and collected some noise points, where the darker the dot, the higher the decibel reading. And then they went and found some data that they had in their office from the US Census Bureau to look at per capita income, just to start doing some hypothesis generating to see if there's any trends worth looking at. So this was just a map they were able to produce after a 4-hour workshop and going out and collecting some data. So from there, and they kept working on that for a number of years. From there, we went to Honolulu, Hawaii for another case study, because we had other connections with Native Hawaiian populations in Oahu. So we went to Honolulu, and we were working with the John Burns School of Medicine, and they were interested in obesity in Native Hawaiian populations. So the first thing they did was use QGIS to buffer the center of their communities by 2 miles, I think it was, to maybe it was, 1 mile, it says right there in the legend. So these are the Native Hawaiian communities that they wanted to survey. So they used QGIS to make their study area design. And then they developed a data collection form, and we went one day to Kahala and surveyed for anything that could be positive or negative for obesity. So food choices, exercise opportunities, things like that. And so this again went on for several years, and there was a woman there who ended up doing her PhD on some of this work. From there, we went to Charleston, South Carolina. This was the Medical University of South Carolina that we were connected with, and we ended up doing a number of workshops there. So we landed in Charleston, and we ended up doing 3 different trainings there. The first one, 12 people were there. It was mostly the leaders. But it got popular on campus. And so we came back and did another one, had 25 people. And then it really took fire, and they asked me to come back again a couple months later, and I had almost 80 people show up to this workshop, which was a little overwhelming. But it turned out to be really interesting because one of the people at that workshop was a teacher at a local high school. So we went to this high school on St. John's Island outside of Charleston, and I showed these teenagers how to use this data collection app, and they got it on their lunch break. I mean, they just figured it out and started running with it. And so they went way beyond what we expected them to do. They spent the whole summer mapping things on their island related to access to food and water. They found some migrant populations and started becoming concerned about their access to healthcare and where do they go if they need an ambulance. And it was fantastic. And so they ended up using Google Earth to map their points, but they did this all on their own and ended up winning a National Library of Medicine award for all the work. And it was pretty exciting to see these kids get so turned on by this and just run with it. And this was really our goal, was to basically, we had no ownership in the data. We were just kind of empowering people to go do what they did to protect their communities and map their communities. We then went to Miami, Florida, and this isn't exactly the chronological order, but it's close enough. And in Miami, there are these things called king tides, and king tides are basically the highest tide during the year, and they're becoming quite a problem with sea level rise in Miami. So we hooked up with the Florida International University, who is already doing water testing on these king tides, and a couple other local groups. But one thing they weren't doing was mapping the point that they took the sample from. So we added that, but they already had these test kits right here with different tools for collecting salinity and fecal coliform of the water. And so these people here, this was phenomenal, because we went into this community, and these are just people who live in the neighborhood. They didn't know what GPS was, let alone GIS. But they knew there was this problem in their neighborhood, and they wanted to help. And so they just saw us out on the street, and they started asking questions. And so we invited them to a short workshop, and we just showed them how to work the app and the data collection protocol. And they went out the next day with us during the high tide and collected data. And we had, about 15 people from the community come out and do this. And it was just so heartwarming to see them, realize that there's something they could do, because then they could go to the Miami City Council, and then they would have better data than the city council had on what was going on in their neighborhood. And they could start, trying to get some change going on. Another interesting thing that happened here, and I love animations in QGIS. So this is Hurricane Irma. We arrived 5 days after Hurricane Irma had hit. And so I'm a fool for a nice mesh data animation. So here's Hurricane Irma. No, it's this one. This is Hurricane Irma coming in and hitting Florida. And then so we came in 5 days after that. So Miami was a mess. There was debris and brush everywhere. But on top of that, there were these king tides. So this was a low, basically a residential community that was subsidized for poorer people in the community. And so this is at low tide, but you can see this little grate right here. And then when high tide hits, a couple hours later, water just starts percolating up through the grate and cracks in the ground. And a couple hours later, it looks like this. And there was already black mold in this apartment from Hurricane Irma. And then they're dealing with these king tides on top of it. I think this is happening with, happened with Ian just last month as well. So some serious problems. This is another shot. This is an intersection of the neighborhood. And you can see a little flood water from the previous high tide. And then a couple hours later, it looks like this. And over 90% of the samples came back positive for fecal coliform. And, people's kids are walking to school through this, and it's flooding people's yards. And so it's a serious issue. But we were able to show them how to make maps like this, where they had some nice open elevation data from the city of Miami, and they were able to map their points based on flood depth here. And it's a really mixed use neighborhood. You can see some people, this is a little platform that a wealthier person has used to build up their house, so their house does not flood. But along these streets and this is where that apartment complex is, where the ground is just a little bit lower, a couple feet lower, the flooding is pretty intense. This is the same kind of map, but showing the salinity of the water. And so the salinity varies quite a bit. We didn't have the fecal coliform results back to show that on these maps, but we are able to show people how to make these maps. There was one person from New Florida Majority who was going to be responsible for kind of managing the data and trying to get decision makers to be aware of the issues. So another public health spinoff of that was there was basically a customer who had attended one of my community health maps workshops. And I ended up using this software that I'd used for wildlife habitat called Maxent, which is software for modeling species niches and species distributions. But here we used it for MRSA, which is basically antibiotic resistant staph infections. And we had all this great data. And so, that's a critter as much as a deer is, basically. So I thought, why don't we try to use Maxent to model this public health outbreak in Atlanta? And so we were able to produce some nice maps in QGIS, and the analysis was done in Maxent, which is an open source software. So a nice creative use of a software I'd started using in my environmental conservation applications, and here applying it to public health. So that is the public health and conservation side of my business. And then we get into teaching. So years ago, the U.S. Department of Labor developed this pyramid of knowledge that you have to be a working geospatial professional. And a model curriculum was built in the US, done in Esri. And I had a colleague who in 2014 said, hey, do you think you can replicate this in QGIS? And I was like, yeah, let's do it. So, part of it felt like, this is your mission. Did you choose to accept it? And the goal was, if we build it, they will come. This was meant to be, a curriculum that people who wanted to start teaching QGIS in the university could use to make it easier, because I know teachers don't have time to always develop new material, especially when they don't know the software that well themselves. And that led to my first book. I got invited to write a book because of the notoriety behind that. And so this is one of the, there's some things that you don't expect to have consequences, but they do have very positive consequences. So this was with PAC Publishing. It was a little interesting because there were 4 co-authors. And as a sole proprietor, taking the time out to write a book when you're not being paid for it is a little tricky. But it really turned out to be a tremendous investment and has really led to me being able to move to Denmark. So on the heels of that was the first QGIS conference, which happened in Denmark. So again, this felt a little risky to me, because here I am taking time and a lot of money out of my small business to fly halfway around the world to go to this QGIS conference. But it turned out to be one of the most profound things in my professional career. I met all the people that had been just names on Twitter and chats in person. I also met my co-author on that first book, Luigi Pirelli, who I'd never met. We were co-authors, but had never actually met each other. So it was just fantastic. And I'm still friends and colleagues with a lot of the people that were at this first QGIS conference. And on the heels of that, the Geo Academy was getting a little stale. So I decided to publish that as a book, the first Discover QGIS book, as my way of updating it. And I'd had some negative experiences with Pact Publishing, so I chose Locate Press, which was formed by Tyler Mitchell and managed by Gary Sherman, who started QGIS. So it was a really friendly experience, and I recommend them to anyone who wants to write a geospatial book. The Mastering QGIS second edition came out a little before my Discover QGIS that year. I had 2 books that year. And so things were really starting to roll on that front, having 3 books out. And this is what I noticed with writing these books, just kind of gave me street cred and got me my name out there beyond what I ever imagined. So following that, I went back to Denmark for the 3rd QGIS conference, which was another fantastic experience. And this is when my wife and I started thinking about potentially moving to Denmark, because we just fell in love with Denmark. So this brings me up to 2019, just a few years ago, which turned into just a crazy year for me. I still to this day don't even know how I managed to pull all this off. But this is a map I made in QGIS that shows all the trips I took in 2019 to do QGIS trainings. And it was, just amazing. That year I had 30 new customers, 40% of which were new, 12 spatial analysis projects. I taught 17 QGIS workshops. Those were in 6 countries and 7 US states. And so I accomplished something that I called the QGIS Training Hemisphere Grand Slam, because I taught a QGIS workshop in the Northern, Southern, Eastern, and Western Hemisphere that year. And forget what it meant for carbon emissions, but it was also a little bit too much for me. I also started thinking, it feels like people want me to teach QGIS everywhere except where I live. And so again, it started feeling like perhaps we should go somewhere, where we're a little more in the QGIS community. So that one of those trips that year was to the next QGIS conference, which was in A Coruña, Spain. And that year I had produced another update to Discover QGIS 3X, that series. And so this was this title had an entire new section. It was a major update to the book. I removed probably 30 or 40% of the Geo Academy material and updated it with material from my consulting career, basically. And then after that, later that May, I had met Hans van der Kwast at one of those Danish QGIS user group meetings, and he invited me to, since I had ties to Locate Press, to help him publish a book on QGIS for hydrological applications. And so we co-wrote this book together that same year. And this is a fantastic workbook for doing hydrologic work in QGIS. So one of the things that happened when I was in A Coruña was I taught an advanced data visualization with QGIS workshop, which is always a lot of fun for me. And there were a lot of QGIS developers in the room, and that can be a little intimidating. You get a little imposter syndrome there. But I soon realized that some of the developers don't really learn to actually use the software. And they were really blown away by what could be done with QGIS 3.0 at that time. So it was that was a cool experience to realize that. So also at that Spain conference, I met some QGIS colleagues, and we formed this new business called the Q Cooperative, which is still going today. We didn't form it as an official business because we all had other jobs and we were from 6 different countries. But we cooperated on QGIS projects, and they're still growing strong, and they've grown. So this was the book picture of 2019, 3 different books. This one, Mastering Geospatial Development with QGIS 3X, came out without me even participating in it. I just saw that it came out. They didn't even tell me that that 3rd edition was coming out. That was kind of interesting. Another trip from that year was to IHE Delft, where Hans and I taught using our new book, QGIS for Hydrological Applications. And we had a huge class of people from the global south from 20 different countries. They were all professional hydrologists in their own countries, but they lacked a lot of computing skill and were very shy. You kind of had to extract questions out of them. And to finish up 2019, just a few weeks before I went, I got a call through my public health connections to teach a QGIS course in Pago Pago, American Samoa. So I'd already been to Europe twice, Hawaii, and all these places. And just before Thanksgiving in the US, I flew to Pago Pago and taught a QGIS workshop down there, a three-day course, basically. And this was an amazing experience because it's this tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific. And I don't think I've ever experienced so much laughing in a course in my life. They were amazing. And there were also some serious challenges because it had come up so quickly. I just assumed, well, when I get there, we'll just download the QGIS installers and we'll install QGIS and get up and running. But the internet quality was so poor in the building that, you know, the little computer time on the download said it was going to take like 16 hours when I got there. And so I had to ask them, okay, is there another building around in town that you could go to download this and just bring the installer back on a thumb drive so we can get started? And there were a couple, you know, scary moments as a teacher like that, but we worked it out. So after that amazing experience in American Samoa, the pandemic hit. Again, I'm a fool for a nice QGIS visualization. So this is one I did for COVID-19 cases early in the pandemic in the US based on the open New York Times data. To show the outbreak. And so that changed the world when COVID hit. So during 2020, I was dealing with that. And basically, the Trump administration reorganized the National Library of Medicine to the point that they wanted no more minority outreach. So the Community Health Maps project was just terminated. And that had been a major source of my income for 10 years at that point. So that was a pretty big hit to my business. My wife's business had to close. And we started thinking maybe this is a good time to pick up and move. So to make a long story short, I accepted a position with Septima, which is a nice Danish open source geospatial firm. And they basically were formed to provide, basically their mission is to provide services around open Danish data. And they have a pretty talented staff. They have a gentleman who developed the flat GeoBuff format, Bjorn Hartel, which is a new kind of replacement potential for shapefiles. So one of my role there is to basically do QGIS training, QGIS support, and I still work for my North American customers, those who will still work with me. So Septima also produces a lot of plugins for QGIS, basically around accessing Danish data. So this is one called Data Forsyning that you can install and identify which data set you want to add. This next one is a panel for address geocoding in Denmark. So here I'm just typing in my own address and it zooms right to my house here in Denmark. And this other plugin that's really popular here that Septima's developed is the QLR browser, which basically lets you set up a panel with a series of QLR files so that you can just toggle organized data off and on. So those are probably the three most popular Septima plugins that have been developed here in Denmark. And I thought I'd finish with kind of some thoughts about what I've noticed after being here now for 2 years between QGIS and GIS in the USA versus Denmark. So first of all, everything in Denmark is digital and integrated. I'm talking about healthcare, taxes, vehicle registration, housing deeds, buildings, everything is online. In Denmark, they abolished paper checks in 2016. So it's a very online community. Everyone has access to high-speed internet. Another interesting thing, though, that I have encountered is that there are very few self-employed people. Like there aren't too many people in Denmark that do what I used to do in the States or even run small geospatial businesses. It's not really a thing here. Most are involved in bigger companies. Denmark, so you know what, the US has 350 million people, and I think there's about 5 who are usually active in the US QGIS user group, and I'm still one of those. In Denmark, there's a huge QGIS user group. Denmark has a little under 6 million people, and on the Facebook group, for example, there's 1,300 members who are constantly chatting about QGIS. And QGIS use is pretty widespread in Denmark. But most of the users are creating pretty basic maps. They're not doing a lot of spatial analysis and things like that, but everyone is using QGIS to basically make maps for reports. Also, the courses tend to be shorter. You know, I used to commonly teach a 3-day intro to QGIS class, but in Denmark, the longest courses are a 6-hour day. So that's quite a difference as well. And then there's, of course, the Danish language, which for me is still a pretty big issue. I'm learning Danish and I function in the Danish office, but the sooner I can become fluent, the easier my life will be. So some other things that are interesting here is that in Denmark, MapInfo was the historically dominant GIS software. And now that MapInfo is getting a little stale, people are migrating either to ArcGIS or QGIS. And all the Danish municipalities are big QGIS users. A lot of them have switched to QGIS. And their QGIS setups are very automated. So there's a lot of use of QGIS project templates, using of that QLR browser plugin to access data, custom QGIS profiles that strip away a lot of the other unnecessary tools and buttons, and then heavy use of print templates so that people can just open up a project, turn on the layers they want, open up use a print template and create a map very quickly. And that's how a lot of people are using QGIS in Denmark these days. So very basic use. But use of PostGIS is also widespread. A lot of agencies and organizations use PostGIS for their data, which is cool. So getting near the end here, so this year, 2022, was also a huge year for books. So at this point, it's hard to believe there's been 8. And this year is the 2nd edition of QGIS for hydrological applications and Discover QGIS 3X. And for the nerds out there, I get asked, how long does it take to write one of these? Well, at Locate Press, these are all done in LaTeX using RST and YAML and a pipeline to create a PDF. And they're all stored in GitLab repos. So this is a screenshot of my GitLab repo commits for Discover QGIS 3X. So it took me 5 months basically to update the book on weekends and evenings. And if there's any questions about the book, I'm happy to answer those, but I think I'm close to time. So I'm just going to put on the last slide about questions and see what kind of questions have popped up.
That's great, Kurt. Thanks. Yeah, we have a couple. I'll let you do the ones that are here, and then I have a bunch for you too.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. Phil Davis, what penetration in the GIS market does Esri and other commercial software enjoy? Well, Esri is not minor here. Like I said, as MapInfo kind of dies, I don't really have a good feel for how much, but there's certainly a number of people who are switching to ArcGIS. Like I know the Federal Health Ministry here is using ArcGIS quite heavily. So that's one example. So it's definitely a presence. And Bernie Connors asks, how is the open data in Denmark being served? OGC services or mostly OGC services. So it's all being served by WMS, WFS.
A lot of GeoServer for that, or what kind of, or are we using MapServer or GeoServer a lot throughout the country? I guess at the government level.
Yeah, I would say GeoServer is used pretty heavily. At Septima, we use a combination. We're using QGIS server quite a bit as well. So I think more and more using QGIS server here as well, along with MapServer and GeoServer.
So
GeoServer probably is the dominant one.
Yeah, and just to say it, I put a message in the chat, but everybody can post questions if you have Q&A. Oh, Bernie has a follow-up question for you. Oh, more coming in.
So the Septima plugins for QGIS all interface with, yes, correct. There's basically they're basically sitting on top of QLR files on a server that point to WFS or WMS services.
And Fiona has a question. Good one.
I know this is a QGIS webinar, but since you got back to earlier GIS days like me, I wonder if you ever got into GRASS. What about Saga? Yeah, absolutely. I definitely got into GRASS. And I was curious about Saga. I never really figured Saga out. So it's one of the things I like about QGIS is that you can use QGIS as a front end to those. But I've definitely used GRASS natively, and I used to teach it in my open source class.
Awesome. Mike, oh, more questions rolling in. Go for it.
Is English used to fill the data, or is everything's in Danish? And something you may not have realized is that the QGIS processing toolbox is alphabetical. So when I use the Danish version, I cannot rely on position to figure out where a tool might be. When is your next session on the QGIS Open Day? Oh, I don't know. I don't have any plans for a QGIS Open Day talk, but you know, if the inspiration strikes, I'll certainly do something.
I'm gonna squeeze one in here. With Septima, are you working with any new type of clients? Like obviously conservation, public health, this is something that you're really passionate about and that you have a lot of experience working on, but do you find yourself now that you're in Europe doing something different?
All entirely different. I'm working for utility providers, the Danish Meteorological Institute, all the municipalities, which are dealing with parcel boundaries and, you know, road center lines and things like that. So there's very little conservation here. You know, Denmark doesn't have the same kind of open wildlands that we did in the Western US. So it's not really a thing here.
I have a question. I'm curious about this. So when you're running your own company, and doing all this teaching and traveling all around the world, doing these in-person sessions, what percentage of your sort of business at that point as a consultant was teaching versus actually doing GIS work and analytical work?
I think in 2019, which was a crazy year, but I boarded 50 flights. I think the teaching was probably easily 40% of my income that year.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Good question just popped up. Do you plan a session in Africa?
Well, you know, I'm a consultant, so if there's money, absolutely. But I can't do it for free. That's always the issue. So,
expensive.
You know, basically, if there's money for me to do something, I'm happy to do it.
So what do you prefer doing? Now you wear many hats. So you're a teacher, you write books, you actually do the GIS work. If you had to choose, which one of those things would you do?
Probably the GIS work.
The GIS
work. Yeah, that's you know, I love just sitting down, putting on some music and doing some GIS.
So to close this off, you and I had a nice discussion about that process of moving overseas. I had that experience, and you're going through this now, making that big step. For anybody out there who's maybe considering making that big move one day, do you have any advice for them?
I think you have to have a niche. You know, you have to have a, I think you have to have, if you're going to change countries too, you have to have a real, you have to be committed because it's a lot of work, you know, so, I'm sorry. Yeah. You were asking about changing countries.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're changing country, if you're moving to a new country, you have to be very serious about it. You have to do research on, you know, how that's going to work. What are the immigration laws and all of that, and what's involved in you being able to stay there and getting a visa, all those kinds of questions. But I certainly recommend it because the world is a big place and it's fascinating to be in a different culture and see a different way of doing things.
It's amazing. So a bunch of questions just popped up. Do you want to try to quickly run through those?
Yeah, let's do it. Over the years working with conservation orgs, did you find they were getting their own GIS capacity? Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of times they would find like just a student intern who was 10 times slower than me and was only going to last 6 months, and then they would need me again. So that was kind of interesting. Any recommendations on how to sell the use of QGIS or other opens? That's a tough one. That's the perennial question. It takes a champion, is all I can tell you. You have to really have a strong use case and really push hard to usually overcome proprietary software with open source software in an organization.
And then I think Sebastian's is the last one.
In the future, do you think legislation in the US could encourage the usage of FOSS? I honestly think it's unlikely, but you never know. Yeah.
Well, with that, Kurt, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for your presentation and for just sharing your very unique story. And yeah, this is great. And I hope that in 2023, we'll have a bunch more stories like this to share.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Kurt. Talk soon.
Bye.
See ya.